All right, so now we're talking about timbre and color, and I want to introduce you to three principles of color. Okay, register, range, and timbral character. So what is register? Register is how high or low an instrument is. So for example, a cello generally plays lower pitches than a violin, or a double bass plays lower even than a cello. So instruments generally have a register. A bass guitar, you don't play lead guitar lines on a bass guitar because it's got lower register than a typical guitar. A piano has an enormous set of registers, and we call that range. So there's also how many registers are included in an instrument. A violin just simply cannot play the low tones of a double bass, and a double bass just simply cannot play the high pitches of a violin. So a violin is occupying a different register, but the violin and the double bass may have a similar range, but in totally different registers. So register and range are important considerations. Why? Well, register can be very effective when you're trying to convey specific emotions. So for example, a high register, as I use in my spooky cue here, I have this kind of glockenspiel bell sound. Sounds a bit like a Harry Potter piece of music. It's a bit spooky, it's a little eerie, and it's high-pitched. What high-pitch and high-register instruments tend to convey is that they're kind of diminutive. They actually kind of make people feel small, whereas a bass can really convey power, but it can also convey threat. So register is an important part of using color and timbre in your theme. Then there's range. And what's the range of an instrument? I mentioned a minute ago that a piano has an enormous range, while a violin has relatively little range. Then there's timbral character. In my urgent cue, I'm using French horns and timpanis and the cello there. The reason that I'm using those is because the French horns convey a sense of sort of regalness and royalty, of importance. The choice of the timpani is very orchestral, it's very boomy, it's very sort of classical. It conveys a sense of tradition. And so all of that put together winds up conveying something that is very recognizable to the listener as being urgent and triumphant. Like we're going off to battle, that kind of feel, because of the instruments that I chose. And that's really what timbre is, choosing a specific set of instruments to convey a specific emotional effect. Later on, when I break down each one of these cues, I'll talk about how I made timbral choices for each one of these cues. But be aware that using color and timbre is extremely important. And when it comes to creating theme and variation, it's one of the best ways to explore different variations with your theme. Just as an example, let's take this melody from my urgent cue, and let's drag it over onto the piano. See how that sounds? It has a different emotional impact. It doesn't sound as grounded and as triumphant and regal as it did when it was a French horn. Furthermore, if I move it over here to the glockenspiel, now here I'm actually not hearing any sound. The reason is that my instrument, the glockenspiel, knows full well that this is out of the glockenspiel's range. I would have to move these notes up in terms of their register if I wanted to play them with a glockenspiel, because a glockenspiel does not have the same extensive range as our piano, or in this case the French horn as well. So there are just a few examples of how to consider color and timbre in your composition. Of course, you'll see later on in the course when I break down each one of these cues, I'll really explain each individual element in more detail. Now let's move forward, and I'm going to take you through a step-by-step of creating your first theme.